You didn't click this by accident. And no, I'm not saying that in a dramatic way. I'm saying it because something in you hesitated before pressing play. That tiny pause you felt, like you were deciding whether to hear something you already knew might hurt a little. That pause matters. Because people don't hesitate unless part of them already recognizes the truth waiting on the other side. There are messages we don't open because we're scared of what they'll confirm. Not because we don't want answers, but because we already feel them forming. This is one of those moments. And if your chest feels slightly tight right now, or your thoughts slowed down unexpectedly, that's your cue to stay. Not for entertainment. For clarity. You've been carrying something quietly. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. The kind of weight that doesn't show up in conversations but shows up when you're alone. When you replay moments that ended without proper closure. When you ask yourself why certain connections linger even after distance. When you wonder why moving on felt harder than it logically should have. What you're about to hear isn't meant to reopen wounds. It's meant to explain why they never fully closed. There's a specific reason this message feels heavy before it even begins. It's because it wasn't sent when it should have been. It was delayed. Not out of cruelty. Out of fear. Fear of saying the wrong thing. Fear of disrupting what felt fragile. Fear of admitting something once spoken couldn't be taken back. And that fear didn't belong to you. For a long time, you assumed silence meant indifference. Or confusion. Or bad timing. You tried to be mature about it. You told yourself if it mattered, it would have been said. You convinced yourself that no message was also a message. And you learned to live with that explanation even when it didn't fully sit right in your body. But here's the part most people never tell you. Sometimes silence isn't absence. Sometimes it's restraint. There was something your soulmate wanted to say but couldn't find the right moment for. Not because the feeling wasn't strong enough, but because it was. Because naming it would have changed everything. And they weren't ready for that change yet. You didn't imagine the connection. You didn't exaggerate it. You didn't feel too much. What you felt was mutual recognition that arrived before readiness. And when recognition comes before courage, it often turns into quiet distance instead of open truth. This is where the story usually gets simplified. People say, if they wanted to, they would. And sometimes that's true. But sometimes wanting isn't the missing piece. Sometimes readiness is. And readiness has nothing to do with love and everything to do with self-honesty. Your soulmate wasn't ready to face the version of themselves that loving you would require. Because loving you wouldn't have been casual. It wouldn't have been half-present. It wouldn't have allowed old patterns to survive untouched. And that realization scared them more than losing you did. So they held back. Not because you weren't important. But because you were. And that's the part that changes how you understand everything that followed. This message you're hearing now isn't dramatic because it isn't new. It's what was always underneath the pauses. The delays. The moments that felt unfinished. It's the truth that lived in what wasn't said. Your soulmate would tell you this if they could speak without fear now. I saw you more clearly than I let on. I noticed how deeply you listened. How carefully you chose your words. How you felt things fully without trying to control them. And that scared me, because I knew if I stayed close, I couldn't keep pretending I was only half available. They would tell you they felt exposed around you. Not judged. Exposed. Because you didn't demand authenticity, you naturally invited it. And people who aren't ready to meet themselves often retreat from that invitation. You didn't do anything wrong by being real. You didn't love incorrectly. You didn't miss a sign you should have caught sooner. The timing wasn't about circumstances. It was about internal alignment. This is the part that hits deep, because it asks you to release self-blame that never belonged to you. You weren't left because you were lacking. You were paused because you were awakening something they hadn't prepared for. That's also why the connection didn't fade cleanly. It didn't end with anger or betrayal. It dissolved into ambiguity. Because ambiguity felt safer than truth at the time. But ambiguity leaves residue. It leaves questions. It leaves energetic threads that don't cut easily. And you've been carrying those threads longer than you realized. Here's what matters now. This message isn't arriving to pull you backward. It's arriving to set you free. Because the final message your soulmate never sent isn't asking for another chance. It isn't asking you to wait. It isn't asking you to hold space anymore. It's saying, I see now what I couldn't face then. And I know you deserved clarity instead of silence. That clarity is not an invitation. It's a release. You don't need to respond to it. You don't need to reopen the door. You don't need to imagine different outcomes. You just need to let the truth land where confusion used to live. And when you do, something shifts. The lingering ache softens. The questions lose their grip. The connection stops pulling on you from the past and becomes a lesson instead of a weight. This wasn't about loss. It was about timing meeting truth too early. And now that truth has arrived in a form that doesn't require you to do anything except understand. Sit with that for a moment. If this message felt uncomfortably accurate, not dramatic but personal, that's because it wasn't written to impress you. It was written to reach you. And if you want to stay connected to messages that speak to the parts of life people usually avoid naming, you can like, share, or subscribe. Not because you're waiting for someone else's message anymore, but because you're finally listening to your own. Before anything else, notice how your body reacted after the first part ended. Not emotionally, but physically. Maybe you sat still for a second longer than usual. Maybe you felt an urge to look away and didn't. Maybe something in you felt exposed without being attacked. That reaction matters more than words, because it means this isn't just a story you're listening to. It's something your nervous system recognizes. This part doesn't begin where the last one left off. It begins somewhere quieter. In the space after the realization settles. In the moment when you're not shocked anymore, just thoughtful. Because once truth lands, it doesn't keep yelling. It waits to see what you'll do with it. There's something your soulmate never said that goes deeper than the message itself. It's not about love or regret or timing. It's about the moment they realized you saw through them without trying to. You didn't interrogate them. You didn't demand explanations. You didn't push for confessions. You simply existed as yourself. And that was enough to disrupt the version of them they were hiding behind. People don't pull away when they feel nothing. They pull away when they feel too much and don't know how to hold it responsibly. Your soulmate didn't disappear because they stopped caring. They disappeared because staying present required a level of honesty they hadn't yet learned how to live with. And that's an uncomfortable truth, because it removes the simple narratives. It doesn't let you label them as cruel or careless. It forces you to see them as human. Unready. Split between who they were and who they were becoming. There was a moment, whether you noticed it or not, when they almost spoke. Almost told you what you meant. Almost admitted the weight of the connection. Almost crossed the line between safety and truth. That moment didn't pass quietly for them. It lingered. It followed them into unrelated days. It surfaced when they were alone. It returned at night when distractions fell away. But instead of choosing honesty, they chose distance. Not as punishment. As protection. For themselves. That choice didn't erase what existed between you. It just froze it in time. And frozen things don't disappear. They remain suspended, waiting to be acknowledged. That's why this connection stayed alive in you longer than logic could justify. That's why it didn't dissolve like others. Because it wasn't finished. It was paused. Here's the part most people never talk about. When someone walks away from a connection they weren't ready to honor, they don't walk away clean. They carry the unresolved truth with them. It shows up later as comparison. As dissatisfaction. As a quiet sense that something meaningful was left unclaimed. Your soulmate has been carrying that, whether they admit it or not. But this isn't about them anymore. Not really. This part is about you and what happens after the truth stops hurting and starts clarifying. You've probably noticed that after everything, you didn't harden. You didn't become cynical. You didn't close yourself off completely. But you did change. You became more careful with your energy. More selective with your openness. Less willing to fill silence with effort. That wasn't bitterness. That was self-respect growing quietly. You learned something important without meaning to. You learned that connection without clarity costs too much. That emotional availability without direction drains you. That being patient with ambiguity slowly teaches you to abandon yourself. And once you learn that lesson, you can't unlearn it. Your soulmate's final message, the one they never sent, carries another layer beneath the apology and recognition. It carries acceptance. Acceptance that you were not meant to stay in that suspended state forever. Acceptance that you were meant to outgrow the version of love that required waiting. If they could speak now without ego or fear, they would tell you this. You didn't lose me. I lost access to you by not meeting you where you were. That sentence matters. Because it reframes everything. You didn't fail to hold the connection together. You honored yourself enough not to beg clarity from someone who couldn't offer it yet. You chose dignity without making a scene. And that choice changed your trajectory, even if it felt lonely at the time. There's a quiet strength in that kind of departure. Not dramatic. Not empowering in the cinematic sense. But real. The kind that rewires how you move through future connections. You may notice now that you're less impressed by intensity. Less drawn to emotional highs that come without stability. Less willing to invest in potential alone. That's not you becoming guarded. That's you becoming accurate. Accuracy in love is rare. It comes from experience, not advice. Your soulmate's silence forced you to become accurate. It taught you to listen to what isn't said. To trust patterns over promises. To recognize when something feels unfinished for a reason, not as an invitation to stay stuck. And here's the part that brings this full circle. Their final message doesn't arrive to reopen the wound. It arrives to close the loop. Not with a reunion. Not with a confession. But with understanding. Understanding releases you from wondering what you did wrong. Understanding frees you from imagining alternate timelines. Understanding allows you to keep the depth without carrying the weight. This is where many people miss the point. Closure isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's an internal click. A moment when confusion turns into clarity and the emotional charge dissolves. You're not meant to carry unfinished messages forever. You're meant to integrate them and move forward differently. And you already are. Notice how your standards feel quieter but firmer now. Notice how you don't chase resonance the way you once did. Notice how you can sense misalignment earlier without needing proof. That's the legacy of this connection. Not heartbreak. Not loss. But refinement. The final message wasn't meant to bring them back into your life. It was meant to return you to yourself with more honesty than before. Sit with that. If this part feels slower, more reflective, that's intentional. This is the phase where meaning settles instead of explodes. Where understanding replaces longing. And if you choose to continue with this series, to stay with messages that don't manipulate emotion but respect it, you can like, share, or subscribe. Not because you're waiting for someone else's words anymore. But because you've learned how to hear your own, clearly, without fear. There's a strange calm that comes after you stop asking the same questions over and over. Not because you suddenly got all the answers, but because the questions themselves lost their grip on you. You don't wake up wondering anymore. You don't replay scenes in your head with the same urgency. Something inside you has quietly decided it's done negotiating with the past. That's where this part begins, in that understated calm most people overlook because it doesn't feel dramatic enough to be important. What you're experiencing now is not distance from what happened. It's integration. The connection didn't disappear from your life story, but it stopped defining the present chapter. And that shift didn't come from willpower. It came from repetition. From seeing the same pattern enough times to finally understand it wasn't going to resolve itself the way you once hoped. Your soulmate's silence didn't just hurt because it was silence. It hurt because it came at a moment when you were ready to be real. You weren't asking for perfection. You weren't demanding certainty. You were simply open. And openness, when it isn't met, doesn't close neatly. It lingers. It echoes. For a long time, you thought what kept you attached was the connection itself. But it wasn't. What kept you attached was the lack of resolution. The unfinished energy. The sense that something honest was supposed to be said but never was. That kind of ending doesn't feel like an ending at all. It feels like suspension. And suspension is exhausting. Here's something important that doesn't get said enough. When someone leaves without clarity, the person left behind often becomes the one doing all the emotional processing. You replay. You analyze. You try to understand both sides. Meanwhile, the other person avoids, distracts, or compartmentalizes. That imbalance creates a delayed grief. One that doesn't hit all at once, but slowly, in waves. You carried that grief longer than you needed to. Not because you were weak. Because you were thoughtful. You believed understanding would eventually bring peace. And understanding did come. Just not in the form you expected. It came as acceptance. Acceptance that they weren't withholding the truth because you weren't worthy of it. They were withholding it because they weren't ready to live by it. Acceptance that you didn't miss your chance. You reached the edge of what was possible at the time. And acceptance that holding on any longer would have meant betraying yourself. Those realizations don't arrive loudly. They arrive gradually. You notice them in how your reactions change. In how certain memories no longer sting the same way. In how you can think of them without your chest tightening. That's not numbness. That's healing becoming practical. Your soulmate's final message, the one you never heard directly, continues to unfold in layers. The first layer was recognition. The second was regret. This layer is responsibility. Not yours. Theirs. Whether they admit it consciously or not, they know now that the connection asked something of them they couldn't give at the time. And instead of rising to meet it, they stepped back. That choice has consequences, not as punishment, but as reality. You didn't carry the weight alone because you were meant to. You carried it until you learned what it was teaching you. And what it taught you was discernment. You can feel that discernment now. It shows up as a pause before you invest. As a quieter curiosity instead of instant attachment. As an ability to notice when someone is emotionally present versus emotionally available only on their terms. That skill didn't come from books or advice. It came from lived experience. There's a part of you that once believed love meant staying soft no matter the cost. You believed patience would be rewarded. You believed if you didn't pressure the moment, it would eventually open on its own. Those beliefs weren't naive. They were generous. But generosity without boundaries eventually turns into self-erasure. You learned that lesson without becoming bitter. That's rare. Now, when you think about your soulmate, the feeling is different. It's not longing. It's not resentment. It's recognition. Recognition that the connection mattered, but it didn't own you. Recognition that something meaningful can still be incomplete. Recognition that not every soul connection is meant to last, but every one is meant to teach. That shift is subtle, but it's everything. Because now, when something new enters your life, you won't bring the same expectations. You won't accept ambiguity as depth. You won't confuse emotional distance with mystery. You won't wait in silence hoping someone else finds the courage to meet you. You didn't become harder. You became clearer. And clarity changes how destiny works around you. It filters what can reach you. It shortens detours. It protects your energy without closing your heart. Your soulmate's final message was never meant to pull you back into the past. It was meant to release you forward with more awareness than before. To help you stop wondering if you imagined something that was real. To help you understand that the timing wasn't wrong. The readiness was. That distinction matters, because it lets you keep your faith in connection without clinging to a specific person. You're allowed to honor what was without revisiting it. You're allowed to remember without reopening. You're allowed to move forward without guilt. There's a quiet dignity in that kind of closure. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand validation. It simply changes how you carry yourself. If you look closely, you'll notice you're standing a little differently now. You don't lean into conversations the same way. You don't overextend to keep things alive. You don't explain your depth to people who don't ask the right questions. That's growth integrated, not performed. This part of the journey isn't about what your soulmate might do next. It's about what you've already done. You stayed open long enough to learn, and you stepped back in time to protect yourself. That balance is rare. Let this part settle without trying to make sense of it all at once. Meaning will continue to unfold in small, quiet confirmations. In how future connections feel steadier. In how your intuition speaks more clearly. In how you trust yourself sooner. And if this series continues to resonate because it feels human instead of manufactured, reflective instead of manipulative, you can like, share, or subscribe. Not because you're waiting for another message. But because you've learned how to recognize truth when it arrives softly, without needing to shout. There's a moment that catches you off guard, usually when you're doing something ordinary, when you realize you're no longer bracing yourself. You're not subconsciously preparing for disappointment. You're not scanning for signs or reading between lines. You're just present in what you're doing. That realization feels almost unfamiliar at first, because for a long time your emotional world was shaped by anticipation. This part begins in that unexpected sense of ease, because ease is often the clearest sign that something inside you has finally settled. You didn't arrive here suddenly. This wasn't a switch that flipped overnight. It happened gradually, through small choices you didn't even label as healing at the time. Choosing not to reopen conversations that went nowhere. Choosing rest over rumination. Choosing to trust what patterns were showing you instead of what words once promised. Each of those choices pulled you a little further out of the emotional fog you used to live in. For a long time, part of you believed that holding on was a form of loyalty. That letting go without explanation felt like giving up too soon. You thought patience was the same thing as depth. That belief kept you anchored to something that was never fully meeting you. Not because you lacked strength, but because you had too much empathy. You understood people deeply. Sometimes deeper than they understood themselves. And that understanding made it easy to excuse what didn't feel right. What changed wasn't your capacity to understand. It was your willingness to keep sacrificing yourself for it. There's a difference between compassion and self-abandonment, and you crossed that line so quietly you didn't even notice at first. You told yourself you were being mature. That you were giving space. That you weren't pressuring the moment. But underneath those explanations was a simple truth you weren't ready to say out loud yet. You were waiting for someone else to choose clarity for you. That waiting didn't make you weak. It made you human. But it also taught you something important. It taught you how heavy uncertainty becomes when it lasts too long. It taught you how silence can slowly reshape your self-perception if you let it. And eventually, it taught you that love shouldn't require you to live in suspense. Your soulmate's final message wasn't just about what they couldn't say back then. It was about what you were meant to learn by living through the silence. Not as punishment. As preparation. Because now, when you look back, you can see the pattern more clearly. You were carrying the emotional responsibility for both of you. You were holding space for possibilities they hadn't committed to. You were maintaining the connection through your imagination and hope, while they stayed protected by ambiguity. That imbalance couldn't last forever. The shift happened when you stopped trying to keep the energy alive on your own. At first, it felt uncomfortable. Like something was slipping through your fingers. You questioned yourself. Wondered if you were being too harsh. Too distant. Too quick to step back. But over time, you noticed something else. Your nervous system began to calm. Your thoughts slowed down. The constant emotional vigilance faded. That's when you understood that what you were letting go of wasn't love. It was strain. Strain disguises itself well. It can feel like longing. Like attachment. Like depth. But strain always comes with exhaustion. And love, real love, doesn't exhaust you into confusion. It steadies you into clarity. Your soulmate's silence forced you to confront that truth in a way words never could. It removed the option of continuing the fantasy unchecked. It forced you to face reality as it was, not as you wished it to be. That process hurt, but it also sharpened you. Now, when you connect with people, you notice things sooner. You notice how they follow through. How they handle vulnerability. How they show up when things aren't convenient. You don't interrogate these things. You simply observe them. And observation has replaced overthinking in a way that feels surprisingly peaceful. You're no longer trying to decode what someone feels about you. You're paying attention to how they treat you. That shift alone changes everything. It also changes how you remember your soulmate. The memory doesn't carry the same ache anymore. It carries clarity. You can acknowledge what was real without needing it to continue. You can respect the connection without romanticizing the pain. You can see them as someone who mattered, not someone who defines you. That distinction matters because it frees up space inside you. Space that was once occupied by unanswered questions is now available for presence. For new experiences. For connections that don't require constant emotional translation. You might notice that you're less reactive now. When something doesn't align, you don't spiral. You don't try to fix it immediately. You register it. You adjust. That doesn't mean you've stopped caring. It means you've stopped negotiating your worth. There's a quiet confidence in that. Not the loud kind that announces boundaries. The quiet kind that simply lives them. Your soulmate's final message, in its deepest sense, wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was an acknowledgement of a mismatch in readiness. An acknowledging that doesn't reopen the wound. It closes it cleanly. You no longer need to imagine what they would say now. You already know. And knowing doesn't pull you back. It releases you forward. This part of your journey isn't about resolution in the traditional sense. It's about integration. Taking what you learned and letting it shape how you move differently now. You don't abandon your depth. You refine it. You don't close your heart. You protect it with discernment. You're still capable of feeling deeply. You just don't confuse depth with endurance anymore. As you move forward, you may notice that the people who are meant to meet you feel easier to be around. Conversations don't leave you questioning yourself. Silence doesn't feel like punishment. Affection doesn't feel conditional. These aren't coincidences. They're reflections of the internal shift you've already made. The story with your soulmate didn't end in words, but it didn't end unfinished either. It completed its purpose the moment you stopped waiting for it to become something else. And now, there's space. Not empty space. Open space. Space where something honest can enter without resistance. Sit with that feeling for a moment. Not nostalgia. Not sadness. Just awareness. If this part feels calmer than the earlier ones, that's intentional. This is what closure sounds like when it's real. It doesn't shout. It doesn't plead. It settles. And if you choose to continue with this series, it's not because you're chasing answers anymore. It's because you recognize yourself in the quiet truth of it. Because you've learned that the deepest shifts don't announce themselves with drama. They arrive as a steadier way of being. That steadiness is what you carry forward now. There's a moment that arrives without warning, usually when you're least prepared for it, when you realize you don't feel pulled anymore. Not pulled toward the past, not pulled toward explanations, not pulled toward imagining what someone else might finally say. The pull is gone. And what replaces it isn't emptiness. It's quiet control. This part begins there, because losing the pull is often the last sign that something inside you has fully released. You didn't force this release. You didn't wake up one day and decide to be over it. It happened naturally as your attention shifted back to your own life. As your days filled with things that asked for your presence instead of your patience. As you stopped checking emotional doors that had stayed closed too long. Letting go didn't feel like a decision. It felt like returning to yourself. For a long time, part of you believed that if you could just understand everything clearly enough, the attachment would dissolve on its own. You tried to see it from every angle. You considered their fears, their past, their timing, their limitations. You carried compassion like a responsibility. But compassion without reciprocity slowly turns into emotional labor. And emotional labor without rest always leads to depletion. You reached a point where you weren't angry anymore. But you were tired. Tired of holding space for someone who couldn't step fully into it. Tired of translating silence into meaning. Tired of being the one who kept the connection alive internally while nothing moved externally. That tiredness wasn't resignation. It was wisdom surfacing through fatigue. What changed everything was the moment you stopped asking yourself why they didn't choose you and started asking yourself why you kept choosing uncertainty. That question didn't come with judgment. It came with curiosity. And curiosity opened a door honesty had been knocking on for a while. You began to see how much of your energy was being spent on things that never gave anything back. Not just this connection, but the pattern beneath it. The pattern of staying present where presence wasn't met. Of offering understanding where accountability was missing. Of waiting quietly because you believed patience made you deeper. But depth doesn't require suffering. It requires awareness. And awareness is what you gained. Your soulmate's final message, the one that was never spoken aloud, takes on a different meaning now. It's no longer something you ache to hear. It's something you understand without needing to hear it. You know they weren't ready. You know they avoided what they couldn't face. You know the silence wasn't about your worth. That knowledge doesn't sting anymore. It grounds you. Grounding is the real ending of emotional attachment. Not anger. Not closure conversations. Not dramatic goodbyes. Grounding is when the story stops living in your nervous system and becomes just that, a story you remember without reliving. You might notice that memories surface differently now. They don't hijack your mood. They don't spiral into analysis. They arrive, they pass, and you remain intact. That's not forgetting. That's integration. There was a time when you feared that letting go would mean losing something important about yourself. Your softness. Your capacity to care. Your depth. But the opposite happened. Letting go preserved those qualities instead of eroding them. You didn't harden. You clarified. You can feel that clarity in how you show up now. You don't rush emotional intimacy. You don't invest before alignment. You don't confuse interest with intention. These aren't rules you memorized. They're instincts you earned. Your soulmate's role in your life was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to reveal something. And what it revealed was your threshold. How much ambiguity you could tolerate before it began costing you peace. That threshold has shifted now. Not out of fear, but out of self-respect. You no longer need to test people to see if they care. You observe. You notice effort. You notice consistency. And when something doesn't align, you don't argue with reality. You accept it and move accordingly. That acceptance isn't cold. It's efficient. There's a subtle pride in that efficiency. Not ego. Pride in knowing you can walk away without collapsing. Pride in trusting your perception. Pride in choosing clarity over hope when hope becomes a trap. You might also notice that you're less reactive to emotional triggers. Things that once would have sent you spiraling now register briefly and fade. That doesn't mean you're detached. It means your nervous system feels safer. And safety is what allows love to exist without anxiety. The final message your soulmate never sent no longer needs to be imagined. You've already heard it through experience. It said, "I couldn't meet you where you were." And your response, even if you never said it out loud, was, "I won't stay where I'm not met." That exchange didn't happen in words. It happened in growth. This part of the journey isn't about forgiveness in the traditional sense. It's about release without resentment. You don't need to hold anger to justify moving on. You don't need to rewrite the past to feel empowered. You simply recognize what was and choose differently now. There's a quiet dignity in that choice. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't require acknowledgement. It stands on its own. As you move forward, you may notice how differently connections feel. There's less intensity, but more safety. Less mystery, but more presence. Less effort, but more depth. That's not coincidence. It's the result of the internal work you've already done. The space that opened up when you stopped waiting is now available for something else. Something mutual. Something grounded. Something that doesn't require you to disappear in order to stay connected. You don't need to rush that arrival. You don't need to imagine it. Your role now is simple. Stay aligned with yourself. Keep listening to your body. Keep honoring what feels steady instead of what feels dramatic. This story didn't end with a message being delivered. It ended with you becoming someone who no longer needs it. If you sit with that truth honestly, you might feel a sense of calm rather than excitement. That's intentional. Calm is what remains when attachment has been replaced by self-trust. And if you continue with this series, it won't be because you're searching for signs or closure. It will be because you recognize your own reflection in these words. Because you know what it feels like to move on without losing yourself. That's not an ending filled with noise. It's an ending built on strength you didn't even realize you were growing. There's a quiet moment that arrives later than the others, long after the tears stop and the questions fade, when you realize you're no longer explaining the past to yourself. You're not justifying why things happened the way they did. You're not defending your choices or replaying alternate versions of events. The story has stopped arguing with you. It simply exists. This part begins in that stillness, because stillness is where acceptance finally becomes lived, not just understood. What's different now is how neutral everything feels. Not cold. Not distant. Neutral in a grounded way. The memory of your soulmate no longer tugs at you emotionally. It doesn't demand a reaction. It doesn't spark longing or regret. It sits where it belongs, as something that mattered, not something that owns you. That shift didn't happen because you forgot. It happened because you grew strong enough to hold the truth without it hurting you. For a long time, you thought healing meant feeling better. Less sad. Less attached. Less affected. But healing actually meant something else entirely. It meant becoming honest about what the connection was and what it wasn't. It meant letting go of the version of the story where you were waiting to be chosen, and accepting the version where you chose yourself quietly instead. You didn't walk away in a dramatic way. You didn't slam doors or make declarations. You simply stopped carrying something that wasn't being shared. And that choice changed the way your life started to feel, even if it took time to notice it. Now, when you look back, you can see the emotional imbalance clearly without resentment. You were open. You were available. You were present. They were conflicted, hesitant, protective of their own comfort. That mismatch doesn't make either of you villains. It just makes the outcome inevitable. And understanding inevitability brings peace in a way explanations never could. There's a maturity in realizing that some connections don't fail. They complete. They do what they were meant to do, which is reveal something essential, and then they release you. Trying to extend them beyond that purpose only creates suffering. You stop trying. And because of that, you were able to keep the lesson without carrying the pain. You may notice now that you don't talk about this connection much anymore. Not because it's suppressed, but because it's integrated. It doesn't dominate your inner narrative. It doesn't come up in every comparison. It doesn't shape your expectations unconsciously. It taught you what it needed to teach, and then it stepped back. That's how you know it's no longer unfinished. The most important change, though, isn't how you think about the past. It's how you feel in the present. You're calmer in relationships now. You don't rush intimacy. You don't overshare hoping to create closeness. You allow people to reveal themselves over time. That patience isn't passive. It's observant. You've learned that connection doesn't need to be intense to be meaningful. It needs to be consistent. You've learned that silence isn't mysterious when it's repeated. It's information. And you trust yourself enough now to listen to that information without making excuses for it. There was a time when you believed depth meant staying emotionally available no matter what. You believed love meant enduring uncertainty gracefully. You believed if you didn't pressure the moment, it would eventually align on its own. That belief came from a good place. But you've outgrown it. Now you understand that real depth feels steady, not suspenseful. It doesn't leave you guessing. It doesn't ask you to wait indefinitely. It doesn't make you smaller so it can remain comfortable. That understanding didn't make you cynical. It made you selective. You might notice that fewer people have access to you now. Not because you're closed off, but because you're clearer. You no longer entertain emotional dynamics that rely on confusion. You no longer pour energy into people who can't meet you with presence. You don't need to announce these boundaries. They exist naturally. And because they exist, the people who enter your life now feel different. They don't create anxiety in your body. They don't require you to decode their intentions. You feel calmer around them, even if the connection is new. That calm is your intuition recognizing alignment. Your soulmate's role in your life makes sense in hindsight. They showed you how deeply you can feel. They showed you how long you can stay. And most importantly, they showed you the moment when staying longer would have meant losing yourself. That moment is sacred. Not because of the pain, but because of the choice you made afterward. You chose not to disappear into waiting. That choice reshaped you. It reshaped how you approach love, timing, and yourself. You're no longer impressed by words without action. You're no longer attached to potential alone. You don't mistake emotional intensity for compatibility. These aren't rules you follow consciously. They're instincts you earned through experience. There's a quiet confidence that comes with that. Not the kind that seeks validation, but the kind that trusts its own judgment. You don't need reassurance in the same way. You don't need signs to confirm what you already feel. You know when something is right, and you know when it isn't. And you respect that knowing. This part of the journey doesn't end with a realization. It ends with embodiment. You're living differently now. Responding differently. Choosing differently. And those differences show up in subtle ways that add up over time. You wake up with less emotional noise. You move through your days with more presence. You don't carry unresolved conversations in your head anymore. The past doesn't intrude on the present unless you invite it. That doesn't mean life is perfect. It means it's yours again. The final truth your soulmate story leaves you with isn't about them at all. It's about you. It's about realizing that you don't need to be chosen to be worthy. You don't need clarity from someone else to move forward. You don't need a final conversation to close a chapter. You closed it by becoming someone who no longer needed it open. If you sit with this honestly, you might feel a quiet sense of strength rather than emotion. That's not emptiness. That's resolution. The kind that doesn't announce itself, but stays with you. And if you continue with this series, it won't be because you're still attached to the past. It will be because you recognize how far you've come. Because these words reflect a version of you that no longer lives in suspension, but in choice. That's not the end of a love story. That's the beginning of a life lived without waiting. There's a final kind of quiet that arrives only after everything has been felt, understood, and released. It's not the quiet of avoidance or numbness. It's the quiet that comes when nothing inside you is fighting anymore. When you're no longer trying to make sense of what happened, or justify why it mattered, or explain it to anyone else. This ending begins there, in that rare stillness, because stillness is what remains when a chapter truly closes. You're not standing at the edge of the past anymore. You've stepped fully into the present. And the difference isn't dramatic. It's subtle, almost unnoticeable at first. You stop measuring your days by what's missing. You stop wondering how someone else feels about you. You stop carrying conversations that never happened. Instead, your attention turns back to your own life, your own body, your own rhythm. That shift didn't happen because you tried harder. It happened because you stopped holding on. For a long time, part of you believed that letting go meant losing something important. That if you released the connection, you'd lose a piece of yourself along with it. Your softness. Your depth. Your ability to care. But what you discovered instead is that letting go didn't take anything away from you. It gave you space. Space to breathe without tension. Space to feel without anxiety. Space to exist without waiting. You didn't lose your capacity to love. You reclaimed it. The story with your soulmate no longer lives as an open wound or an unresolved question. It lives as a completed experience. One that shaped you, taught you, and then stepped aside. And that's what healthy endings look like. They don't erase the past. They integrate it. They allow you to carry the meaning without carrying the weight. You can see now that the connection wasn't meant to be sustained in uncertainty forever. It wasn't meant to survive on hope alone. It arrived to show you something essential about yourself. About how deeply you feel. How long you're willing to stay. How much ambiguity you can tolerate before it costs you peace. Once that lesson was learned, the connection had fulfilled its purpose. That doesn't make it insignificant. It makes it complete. There's a maturity in recognizing that not every love story is meant to become a life partnership. Some are meant to become a turning point. A mirror. A threshold you cross into a new way of being. You crossed that threshold quietly, without applause, without closure conversations, without grand gestures. You crossed it by choosing yourself in small, consistent ways. Those choices added up. You may notice now that you don't romanticize longing the way you once did. You don't confuse waiting with devotion. You don't interpret silence as depth. That doesn't mean you're less romantic. It means you're more grounded. Your idea of love has shifted from intensity to integrity. From potential to presence. That shift protects you. It protects you from repeating the same patterns with different faces. It protects you from investing in dynamics that rely on confusion. It protects you from shrinking yourself to keep a connection alive. You don't need to announce these protections. They're built into how you move now. There's also forgiveness here, but not the kind that asks you to minimize what happened. It's the kind that releases resentment because resentment no longer serves a purpose. You don't need to be angry to justify moving on. You don't need to villainize anyone to feel empowered. You understand the situation clearly enough to let it rest. Understanding is what replaced attachment. And understanding doesn't ache. It grounds. When you think of your soulmate now, the emotion is quieter. There's respect. There's acknowledgement. There's even gratitude for what the connection revealed. But there's no pull. No urgency. No unfinished sentence hanging in your chest. That absence of pull is not loss. It's freedom. Freedom to meet new connections without projecting the past onto them. Freedom to enter conversations without bracing for disappointment. Freedom to trust your instincts without second-guessing them. Freedom to walk away early instead of staying too long.
You have learned something here. You have learned that love doesn't have to hurt to be real. That depth doesn't require endurance. That connection doesn't need suspense to feel meaningful. Those lessons didn't make you cousins. They made you wise. And wisdom changed the quality of everything that comes next. You might notice that life feels simpler now, even when it's busy. Your emotional world isn't cluttered with unanswered questions anymore. You don't spend your energy trying to decode people. You don't chase clarity from those who can't offer it. You let action speak, you let patterns reveal. You trust what you feel without turning into a debate. The trust is the real ending. Because once you trust yourself, you are no longer at the mercy of someone else's readiness, timing, or courage. You don't wait for permission to move forward. You move forward because it feels aligned to do so. This doesn't mean you are close to love. It means you are open in a way that's sustainable. You can feel deeply without losing yourself. You can care without overextending. And you did. If you look back honestly, you will see how far you come, how much lighter you are now, how much calmer your reaction feel, how little you need external validation compared to before. This ending isn't asking you to celebrate, it's asking you to acknowledge. To acknowledge the strength it took to stay open, to acknowledge the courage it took to step back, to acknowledge the integrity it took to walk away without bitterness. That integrity is what stays with you. Whatever comes next in your life will meet a version of you that no longer lives in a suspension, a version of you that doesn't wait to chosen, a version of you that recognizes alignment when it appears and doesn't chase it when it doesn't. That version of you is steady, present, self-representing. And that's why this story doesn't end with a message finally being delivered. It ends with you no longer needing one. If you take anything with you from this entire journey, let it be this. You are allowed to move on without closure. You are allowed to trust what you felt without proving it. You are allowed to let something meaningful end without it turning into something painful. You didn't lose love. You refined your relationship with it. And as you step forward now into whatever unfolds next, you do without the weight of the fast pulling at your ankles. You move freely, you move honestly, you move as yourself. That's not just an ending, that's the beginning built on self-trust, clarity, and quiet strength. Here this story end. I hope you like this story. If you like, comment to this video, like this video, and subscribe to this channel for more videos like this, more story like this.